Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for some digital security training. I'm Abigail. I'm the program manager of our digital security training team at Freedom of the Press Foundation. And it is my pleasure to introduce David Huerta. David is a senior digital security trainer at FBF, where he trains journalists in privacy enhancing technologies to empower a free press. He's taught hundreds of trainings across the world and has previously organized the digital security track at the National Association of Hispanic Journalists conference. He's also spoken on the subject of usable privacy technology at DEF CON, Radical Networks, RightsCon, Allied Media Conference, and anywhere the words use PGP summon him to a stump speech. So David, with that, I will turn it over to you to give us some digital security 101.
Thanks, Abigail. And as you can probably imagine, we will not be talking about PGP in this particular webinar, but there's a lot of other things that we'll cover. So let's go ahead and kick it off. Um, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So we're going to talk about sort of like more fundamental things to start with when it comes to your digital security. These are more or less kind of the same things that we would tell most of the journalists that we would work with, for example, because we feel that they're kind of foundational to a lot of other topics that we would talk about that are maybe a little bit more advanced. And to kind of find put a fine point on like what we're going to talk about in this particular webinar is basically how to not get hacked. And there's a couple of different facets to this. In this case, we're going to discuss our newsletter, which is basically a thing that we will mention at least two more times in this webinar. Sorry if you're already subscribed, but if you're not, or if you have friends that would be interested in getting a weekly update, a roundup of digital security related stories as it pertains to journalistic work, you can go ahead and sign up here. But we talk about digital security by talking about figuring out what our actual risks are. So in the cybersecurity world, we have a tendency to sort of raise the alarm for like every single possible thing that could go wrong, without necessarily taking into account things like probability or economics. So we're going to take those things into account here. And I'm also going to highlight some sort of like other analogs to the way we approach the world and security and safety. So, a friend of FPF, Susan McGregor, has this really, really great analogy that I love using, which is basically like you're crossing the street. What is the risk assessment? You have basically statistically the thing that kills the most Americans basically zooming past you, and you're about to share space directly in front of them. This is dangerous. Um, and this is, in some cases where death could happen. And we do it anyway because we know that if we have certain practical considerations that we keep in mind, we can do this with a certain degree of safety. And I want to emphasize that point when it comes to digital security as well, is that there's a lot of scary stuff out there. We are sharing the road with a lot of pretty terrible potential threat actors. But I want to offer some reassurance that there are ways that we can navigate the World Wide Web, that we can cross the information superhighway, like with relative safety, with some common sense approaches, which we're going to discuss today. So to give you an idea of what risk assessment looks like in a more sort of like formalized setting or a more formal process, we have this idea that we like to break down um, into a few different questions. So some of you may have heard, if especially if you've heard this term kind of thrown around by people in the cybersecurity industry or in the private industry in the military, like this idea of threat modeling. And we kind of had this more like broader approach to that, where we, actually sit down and go through like, okay, what are the assets that I'm protecting? This could be things like the kind of obvious choices. We don't want people on the internet randomly, like being able to access our emails or our bank information, our passwords, private conversations, etc. There's also the adversary. So this can mean a few different archetypes. This is where the sort of like threat and threat modeling comes from, and how do you like figure out it's like, well, who do I actually have to worry about? Like I know that these hacks happen, but who's actually doing them? Who are they after? Is it somebody that is my adversary? Is this something that somebody that I have to worry about necessarily? And then there's the issue of just like going into the kind of modeling side of that word, threat modeling, and saying like, hey, what are the resources they have? Like, because it seems like from the way things are being reported, these kind of like hacks are happening all the time. They seem all powerful. Is that actually the case? Maybe not actually. And that's something that I want to emphasize here is that, they are not, in fact, all powerful. But different threat actors have different capabilities. Some of them are, not easy to evade in some cases. So there's also the question of likelihood. How big is this actually a risk in this case? Like, is this something that you as an individual necessarily have to worry about? Is this something that is is this scary story about advanced malware necessarily going to affect me as an individual, or is it sort of more specifically targeting other groups of people that maybe I don't have to feel a certain danger about quite yet? And then, of course, there's the question of what you can do. So, what resources do you have at your disposal to protect yourself? And there is a great sort of article that my colleague Davis wrote up last year that talks a little bit about how to go through this mental exercise yourself. So if you're a journalist and you want to walk through the steps of understanding what your risks are and kind of figure out from there, like what are the next steps you need to do to protect your assets, this is a great place, a great read, basically, to start off with, which we recommend. And I don't know if somebody can share that in the chat. That'd be great. So there's two different ways hacking happens. So when people talk about hacking, in terms of just like the kind of more cybercrimey definition of hacking, people usually refer to a couple of different methods. One is hacking your online accounts, and the other one is hacking your devices. We're going to talk about both. Before we talk about devices, we're going to talk about online accounts because here in the year 2025, most of what we do online, it goes through some sort of third-party cloud platform. At your job, for example, you may be using Google Workspace or Office 365, and at home, you might be using your Gmail, you might be using Facebook, you might be using a number of other online services that may contain private information like private conversations and photos and other things. So protecting online accounts is really important, and that's why we kind of like to talk about that before talking about basically everything else. There are a lot of other like really interesting things we can talk about in terms of digital security, including things like communication security. I'm sure people have questions about Signal. We're going to leave those questions. We're going to make ample space at the end for that. So I'm happy to talk about those then. Before we go into that, though, we're going to talk about online accounts. How do people actually get into them? What actually happens when people hack into accounts? Because we have this sort of like Hollywood idea of what hacking looks like, which has some, a little bit of artistic leeway that maybe isn't exactly accurate to the real life, to real life. So shout out to the movie Hackers, love it. Wildly inaccurate in terms of how any hacking happens ever, but really cool special effects for the 90s. Closer to reality, we have Mr. Robot, which takes advantage of proof of concept attacks that were sort of like being demonstrated at the time. Largely, though, these don't happen very often because these are difficult and expensive. And we do see some of the same attacks happening in the real world, but they tend to be in very, very sort of like high conflict areas like war zones. Um, Unfortunately, for most of us, the most ordinary and most common and widespread form of hacking looks More like what happens in or what happened in Kim and Chloe Take Miami, which is the most accurate hacking TV show. So in this case, you can see that there was sort of a tale or some kind of like very sort of crusty looking Florida detective that was hired to look into whether Scott Bio was up to no good and was able to get into social media accounts and kind of look into things that way. And this is unfortunately how it exists in the real world for kind of everybody else. Um, but not everybody, but a certain percentage. Speaking of which, this is Question Cat. Cat has a question for you, which is what percentage of website application breaches, so online accounts, were caused by account hijacking with stolen credentials? Feel free to answer in the chat. I'm curious to see your responses. All right, so we have a pretty wide spread of percentages, 95, 15, 60, 99. Um, all right. So let's go ahead and see what that percentage is. It is closer to 86%. This is according to the Verizon DBIR report. For those of you not familiar with that, it's not the most exciting read. If you're feeling if you're feeling a bout of insomnia and you want something to put you to bed, they did just publish the 2025 report. The downside to it is that it doesn't really do statistics in the same way as they used to, so we don't really have a like perfect analog to this for 2025. The latest one for this is from 2023, and it's basically at 86%, which is a lot. Like it's not everything, but it's a lot. So if we think about it's like, well, if we can figure out a way to address these kind of attacks, these kind of like account credential attacks, that's 86% of the probability just wiped off the map. Not a bad way to progress in our digital security journey. So the problem is that going back to, the reality that we pointed out earlier is that people do unfortunately use the same passwords for multiple accounts because it is just not something our brains are optimized for creating like unique passwords for everything. Which is why I said say don't let the computer do that for you. So the whole point of computers for me is basically to just at a more philosophical level so that humans can have more time doing stuff that we actually want to do, and let computers take like the boring work away. Uh, and one of the examples of this is things like password managers, things like the ability to create secure, unique, long, random passwords that match the website requirements, whatever they may be, automatically and save them so that we don't have to think about them ever. There's a few options here, and there's more and more coming all the time. We're not going to know how secure all of them are. We are looking into, or I'm looking into, for example, the Apple Password Manager, which has been very promising as of late for those of you in the Apple ecosystem. But if you are just kind of want to using a password manager that we've kind of like poked around with a lot, 1Password basically works. Bitwarden is another thing that we've experimented with also that seems to be like reasonably secure as well. There are some use cases where you may want to have passwords that are just like not synced anywhere, that are just like maybe in an air gap computer, which is a computer that doesn't touch the internet. KeePass XC is an option for that. And it's pretty easy to use. 1Password does have a lot of features, but they kind of like implement them in a way that they're not super overwhelming. So you can kind of see here, it's like, oh, here's, websites asking me to create a strong password. And it's asking for specific types of characters, and you can kind of change what you want to do there. This example on screen is actually an example of a passphrase, which, is a fun kind of thing you can do also. We have a specific use case for those, which we'll get into later. But they can be used for what would be considered by the industry to be a super good password. So there's a bit of delay, I guess, between the IT industry and the security research world. Your IT team may say, like, you need to change your passwords every 6 months for no reason, and that it should be, 6 characters long and have like maybe a number or a special character. That doesn't work anymore. One, reusing, forcing people to change their password every certain duration of time largely just leads people to create really predictable passwords. So that's just kind of a bad move. But secondly, if you make your password really long and random, that's kind of what makes it count the most. Um, and of course, uniqueness, which we talked about. So 1Password and kind of every other password manager lets you do exactly this kind of password for your different online websites. And if those websites say like, hey, you need that special character, you need that number, you can have it fill those in as well. One thing that I like to note here that doesn't get talked about very much is that they do place the digits and symbols in random places within this password that it generates. That's super important because generally speaking, these password cracking tools will assume that people are putting the numbers and special characters and things at the end. So if you do that, the password cracking software knows that you're doing that. But the good thing about putting them in random places is that you can't really configure your password cracking software to it has to be a specific place in a long set of characters. So if you can't do that, then this becomes extremely difficult to crack, which is good news for you using a password manager. And there's other advantages to this. Of course, first and foremost, it can create these like very strong passwords. It can store them so that basically after you reset your password to something that a password manager created, you can store them in an encrypted vault that is super secure and more secure than other means. So, for example, you may be storing passwords in a Notes app or in Google Drive, other places to keep them all in one place. The unfortunate reality is that neither of those places are sort of encrypted with a main password, the way a password manager is. And we'll get into what that looks like soon. But that's kind of one of the biggest advantages to this is that even when there have been breaches of password managers, the actual passwords themselves have stayed basically safe because somebody trying to crack those password databases would still have to decrypt every single individual user's vault one at a time. That's not the case when, a big account hack happens. It's like when Sony gets hacked, for example, like that's one of those situations where like that's, you see everybody's passwords and stuff and private data all at once, which is not great. So the other advantages to a password manager is, in addition to the fact that it stores your passwords in a secure way in an encrypted vault, is that number two, it allows you to create shared vaults with different people. So if you have like a family plan, you can share only specific passwords with different family members, or if you're using a workspace account, for example, in your newsroom, you can have different teams with access to different accounts that are only relevant to them. So, like where I work at, for example, I have absolutely no reason to ever log into, like, I don't know, our Salesforce, let's just say. So that's, a password that other people in the organization have in their vault, but I do not have in my team's vault. That way, in case if there's a breach, or an insider threat within like any particular vault access member, it doesn't affect all the other vaults that that person isn't in, which is great. The other thing that it does, and this is not true of all password managers, but is true of things like 1Password and others, is that it does let you know if there have been sort of like passwords that have been found in data breaches. Data breaches, as you unfortunately know, happen all the time. They're not our fault. I used to be a software developer, and the boss would always say, like, don't worry about security, don't worry about security, just get it out there as fast as possible. And lo and behold, that's kind of what everybody does, and that's why we're in the world that we're in. So 1Password in this case has a program for journalists. So if you are a journalist and you want 1Password for free because it does cost money, it's a subscription-based service, you can go through this onepassword.com for journalism program. And yeah, if somebody can drop a link in the chat, that's a really great program to check out. A lot of journalists that we work with really love the fact that they're able to do this because journalists don't get paid that much. The other good and useful thing about 1Password particularly is that their documentation is really, really, really extensive. If you have basically any question about 1Password or any sort of like thing that you run into, there's probably something that has been written about it in their support portal. So you can go to support.1password.com for that. Um, Definitely worth checking out if you do run into any problems using it or just want to learn what all the like sort of tips and tricks are. All right, so we kind of saw a demo of passphrases. And that's kind of like spoiling what I'm going to talk about next, which is basically the password for the password manager. Because ultimately it is a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. If you need if you're using your password manager to generate all the passwords for the different websites and apps you use, what do you use for the password manager itself? Because it has to be memorable. It has to be something you can kind of like quickly enter and use to log into things. So just to kind of give you an idea of what weak versus strong or like bad versus good passwords are, we recommend a passphrase for this one specific case, for the specific case of a password manager passphrase. Because in this case, if you have something like an 8-letter password with even with if it has numbers and special characters, that's short. It's not going to take very long to crack. But if it was like 8 random words or more, then that basically makes it extremely difficult to figure out. So don't actually put your real passwords in these online password checker tools, but just to give you an idea of what this looks like, this is one of the most popular passwords in the English speaking world is password 123. Um, it has unfortunately been found in several breaches and would not take very long for a like modern computer to crack. Versus a passphrase, in this case, randomly generated, doesn't appear because it's unique, it hasn't, been in any known breaches. And you can see here that in order to like come up with in order for password cracking software to figure out like, okay, how do we figure out what this password is? It would take a significantly longer amount of time. Like it gets into sort of like exponential math. We're not going to talk about that exponential math today, but you can do a Wikipedia search for the, I think, rice and chess problem if you want to learn more about the exponential math involved with like why this is difficult. And just to kind of show you what this looks like, so this is a password cracking tool called Hashcat. So it is using a slightly more powerful computer than your average computer. It has an NVIDIA GPU, which you might have seen for people that, play games or do VR stuff or like, do machine learning. And just to play that again, you can see it's trying to crack this password. It's going, it's going, it's going. And then it's like, all right, let's see how long this takes. And there we go. Oh, that's kind of cut off the end. But it was basically a single name that was like 6 digits long. So basically no time at all to crack. And in this case, so let's say we've already gone through this process. Like we've set up a password manager. Okay, good. We've gone through very, one at a time. We're not going to do this all at once, but like we've gone through one at a time and like reset your password to something that a password manager created and saved. Now you are now at the point where like, okay, all my important accounts at the very least, we can work on the other ones also, um, are now protected with a super, super strong password. Great. Now I know if there's a breach, it's going to take a while for that, password cracking software to get to it. But what if it gets phished? Or what if, that time does lapse and maybe it's a breach that doesn't get disclosed and it gets cracked eventually? Um, how do we add additional layers of protection to our accounts beyond just a username and password? So that is where two-factor authentication comes from. And every single place calls this something different. Sometimes it's called 2FA, sometimes it's called two-step verification or multi-factor authentication, MFA. Um, the general concept behind this is that you have basically something that you know. So, like, for example, your password is to get into your password manager. And then, of course, that's one way of proving to a computer, to a platform that you are who you say you are. The other factor could be things like something that you have on your person. So that could be like a phone that you receive a text on with a special code. It could be an app that is on that phone that generates that code for you, which we'll talk about, or a security key, which we'll get into even more later on. So this is what it normally looks like. You have the most common form of two-factor authentication kind of here, and that is basically when you get a text sent to you, sometimes called an SMS text, because that's the name of the protocol the cell towers use. But that's not important. In this case, the way this works is, yes, you still have to enter your password. And if you're logging in from a new device, you generally have to enter in like a code basically to prove that you are who you say you are. And then you're logged in. The problem is that it's not perfect. Um, the kind of issues around SIM jacking vary, and the kind of attacks and who they go after also vary. But these kind of attacks do happen. And what SIM jacking is when somebody steals your phone number. So if you're, for example, um, using your phone, you have your phone that is connected to your SIM card or whatever, and then somebody else, an attacker, basically tries to take over your phone account. Is like goes to Verizon or T-Mobile or whoever, impersonates you using a social engineering attack and says like, "Hey, I'm David Huerta, port my number to this other SIM card because this is my new phone." And if they manage to like trick the phone company into doing that, then now they have your number and they are getting the text for 2FA, which means that if they have both your password and your phone number, that means that they can log in as you with this kind of attack. These do happen. This is a story from AP of that happening to a journalist. They're not very common though, and that's something that I want to emphasize here is that some two-factor authentication, even the text message-based two-factor authentication, is still better than nothing. These attacks do happen, but generally speaking, if you kind of follow up on these attacks on these stories, like pretty much everybody that has been sort of the attacker in these stories has had the book thrown at them in court because there's a lot of very serious laws around this sort of thing and a lot of like record keeping and frankly surveillance in the telephone company that make it incredibly difficult for this attack to really be like stealthy. That being said, though, if we just want to avoid the headache of having or not have to worry about the security of our phone provider, we can also just take them out of the equation altogether and use what is called an authenticator app. So these authenticator apps come in many different sort of like brandings, but they all kind of work the same. So you got Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, Okta, Duo, Authy, Free OTP, like all the ones built into 1Password. Even 1Password has an authenticator app now. And they all kind of work the same way, is you do this one-time setup where you go into your account settings for the account that you want to protect. You scan a QR code. That QR code has a special sort of like bit of mathematical magic to it. And then from there, it syncs to generate a 6-digit code in the device itself, in the app itself, so that you don't have to have a code transmitted to you over the cell tower infrastructure at all. This is great news for a few different reasons, especially, for example, if you're traveling, you don't have your phone number isn't available in the country you're traveling to, you still have the ability to log into things. But also just like you don't have to think about the security of your phone number at all. Like you don't have to have a phone number even to use this kind of thing, which is great. And you can see here that like although like Google kind of pitches Google Authenticator as a thing to protect your Google accounts, you can still use this for other types of accounts. Like you can see a Proton account here, a Google account, and an Autodesk account being protected. And in this case, Microsoft Authenticator, same thing. You get Microsoft Authenticator can also protect your Google account, can also protect like a number of other things that still have that sort of QR code method. And again, Google Authenticator is basically fine. It generally works. Authy is another one, Microsoft Authenticator. They all work basically the same way. So there's not too much of a differential between them. And if you ever were curious about like, okay, there's these different types of two-factor authentication methods. We mentioned the vulnerabilities and the issues around things like text message-based two-factor authentication. How do the other ones stack up? So you can see like that text message version, that SMS code, is still pretty good against like automated attacks, like going back into our sort of like risk analysis and potential adversaries. All the like bots and automated accounts that are out there, like those botnets, like still pretty effective against those. Once you get into targeted attacks, though, it gets a little bit less effective. But as you can see here, we have this security key option, which has a very rare perfect score. You're like, whoa, why isn't anybody just using that? Good question. I think you should. So security keys are awesome. I think they're the greatest thing since sliced bread, except sliced bread is kind of awful. So, the greatest thing since fresh bread, I don't know. But these are great. They are not free, like text messages are sometimes, but you can buy one of these from a number of different vendors, and you can basically use them to log in instead of entering a code. But the good thing about this is one, it's convenient. You don't have to like go into your phone and unlock your phone and like look into an app and oh no, your phone's about to die because the battery's almost drained. Because of all the AI stuff using up all the battery, like you don't have to think about your smartphone at all. The smartphone's out of the equation. That anxiety is out of the picture. You just take your security key, which doesn't need a battery, by the way. You just plug it in, or in this case, if you have the wireless NFC phones, like a kind of tap to pay type thing, you can just hold it up to the top of your phone or in the middle of the phone on some Android phones. And then it just like says like, okay, we've tapped your security key, you're good, you're in. Behind the scenes, there's some like really interesting security things happening. One, it's basically talking to your web browser. So that could be Chrome or Firefox or Edge or whatever. And it's saying, hey, I set up this account on this domain name, this, let's say google.com domain name for this Google account. And this is the TLS certificate, the HTTPS part of that domain name has like a special certificate. And it says like, if you're the certificate owner, you will pass this mathematical quiz basically. And it's like, okay, here's a cryptographic proof. And then if it says like, yeah, okay, here we go, it passes, it lets you in. If it's a phishing site and it tries to pull that off, no, it does not. Even if a phishing site were to trick you into trying to give up your 2FA, a security key won't let you. Like literally, the lines for transmitting that code will not be fired up in the USB line to your computer, which is really great. So that's why these security keys tend to work pretty well. They're not super cheap. There's a few of them out there. Yubico makes them, Google makes the Titan series, which you can look into, and there's also a German company called NitroKey, which makes these as well. But you can connect them by USB, you can connect them like with the wireless tap, and they're just super useful. Like we use them for a lot of things on as everywhere we can basically at FPF. They're also very durable. So this is a video of my friend Scott, who I recruited to sort of like make this fun sort of piece that we wrote about how we check to see how durable these security keys are. Because we know we don't want people to get locked out of their account. We want people to be able to log into the things and have access to the things they need. And, if your phone's dead and you can't accept a text message, or if your phone's dead and your authenticator app isn't working, or if you upgraded your phone and, your authenticator app didn't import anything, like you can still log in with a security key. And if your security key gets ran over by a car, you can still log in. So the thing that we recommend to start, because again, most 2FA methods work for most of the things people are concerned about, is to set up a few different options for two-factor authentication. So yes, you may have to start off with the text message two-factor authentication. But then as you add like an authenticator app also, you can then add a security key and maybe turn off the phone number based one. That being said, though, this is a feature that has to be implemented on the website provider, and not all of them have that. So you can go to 2fa.directory to see what websites, what platforms um, have that available and turned on. Okay. So the thing is, real life doesn't always map out to the best security advice. There are times where we lose our phone. Uh, Sometimes you lose our keys. And there are maybe some situations where lose both our phone and our keys. And for that, we recommend making sure that you grab these backup codes when you set up two-factor authentication. So this is an example from Google, but this is true for other platforms, whether it's X or Facebook or others, where if you set up one of these on, if you set up 2FA on this on these online accounts, you'll be presented with these backup codes. And these are not the normal 2FA codes that you'll be entering. This is basically a separate thing where you can copy these backup codes to someplace safe. For example, the entry for that account in your password manager in a little notes field that you can label 2FA codes. And if you get locked out of, if you lose your phone, if you lose your keys, you can still get back in your account with one of these backup codes. And then after you're logged in, you can add your new security key. You can add your new authenticator app from there. So again, super, super important so you don't get locked out. 1Password lets you like have like labels to fields so your future self can remember like what exactly this like weird set of like numbers and letters is. All right, before we move on to the next section, does anybody have any questions? Let me see what we have in
Yeah,
chat.
we've got a few from the chat. So the first one is from Bridget asking, what if you lose your security key?
Ah, great question. So if you lose your security key, you can still log in using a backup code or another form of two-factor authentication usually. So in most websites, they'll do like, it'll ask you for your security key, and then there's usually a link somewhere that's going to be like, do you not have access to this? Try your authenticator app instead as a backup. Um, the other thing that I recommend, if you're willing to spend the money for it, is invest in a second security key so that you have all your accounts on two security keys, one that you keep in a safe place, one that you carry with you. And then that way you can still log in with your other security key if you lose one of them.
Awesome. We have another question. It's a bit of a specific scenario, so let's give it a shot addressing it. And if we can't with the time we have, I would definitely invite this person to reach out to us and get a one-on-one consultation. But basically, this person's screen is broken and they were unable to use the screen in order to place the phone in repair mode. And they're wondering if it's safe enough to give it to a repair person who is saying they need the repair code, they need the code for the phone in order to get into it
Hmm.
or get a new phone.
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the phone. This is unfortunately just always sort of a kind of annoying thing, I guess, because in the past, you wouldn't need to give a repair person like any special access. You would just basically have them unplug a screen and digitizer and plug in a new one and then like seal it back up. Um, it gets complicated and tricky. So if you're using something like some Android phones don't have this issue at all, and you don't have to give them a code ever. For iPhones, one thing that you could do, it's a little bit of a hassle, but if you have a Mac, you have the ability to back up your phone and create an encrypted backup of your phone in your Mac. So you plug in your phone, you open up the like little smiley face icon, the Finder as it's called. And then in the left side, you'll see like all your normal things like, home and documents and videos and downloads. And then over at the bottom, you'll see like your iPhone. And your iPhone will basically be like talking to your Mac that you own, saying like, do you trust this device? You'll say yes. And then you'll see this basically option that when you click on the like sidebar of your phone, you can actually create an encrypted backup of that phone. What that lets you do is that you can then completely factory reset your phone potentially um, after creating a backup and then send it to the repair place that way. And I would have to look at the Apple documentation to see how that's done from there. Because there's a lot of things you can do to basically control your iPhone from your Mac if you have a Mac. Unfortunately, though, this is limited to Mac users. If you connect your iPhone to a Windows computer, I don't think that's available.
Thanks so much, David. I took care of one in the chat, so I think unless other folks have questions they want to drop in the chat now, we can move on.
Cool. All right, so we're going to talk about protecting your devices. So we just covered talking about how to protect your online accounts. which are, as we know, like very much uh, very popular targets for a lot of cyber attacks that happen in the world. But we're also going to talk a little bit about protecting our devices, because there may be some situations where we are worried about either having them be lost or stolen or seized, basically. And there's some real concerns around this. This is a story from Motherboard back in the day, which first kind of started uncovering this sort of like forensic extraction sort of hardware industry. So if, for example, law enforcement seizes your phone, your device, they might try to extract as much data as they can from it in some cases. And that can be a lot. So when we really think about it, our smartphones are kind of extensions of our brains. Like a lot of our photos, videos, notes, address book, messages, like all these other activities that we do are basically mediated through records kept on this one device. And that makes it a particularly like precarious target. And if that data were to fall in the wrong hands, it is a lot of data. It's a lot of stuff, basically. Things like if you're shooting footage of something happening, your notes, for example, um, messages, again, going back to contacts and all these other things that you may be logged into in these apps. And if your phone is unencrypted and one of these tools connects to it, that basically means they can extract that data and basically investigate it later. However, if your phone or other device is encrypted and it's completely powered down, then that means that if they plug it into one of these devices, they're basically probably not going to be able to access that data, which is great news. There's a few different caveats to this, which we're going to talk about though. First, we're going to talk about the benefits. It's like full disk encryption is super, super, super important. So when we're talking about encrypting phones or laptops, this is basically what that word means, full disk encryption or FDE. It's useful because basically it protects all their data on our devices. Again, like if we're using our phones to talk to like, Google and Facebook and all these other and Apple, iCloud, etc., like that data also exists in the cloud, and that's where account security came in really handy. But in terms of the security of the devices as presented on our phones, this protects the full disk encryption protects that. So it also makes it so that in case if somebody does seize your phone, they can't unlock it and then like mess with it to install malware, for example. So as far as how full disk encryption works, there's a few different ways to set this up. And luckily, if you are on an iPhone, it already exists. This is great news. However, one thing to keep in mind going into caveats is that you do have to have an unlock code set up for this to work. So if you're using an iPhone without an unlock screen unlock code, you're not protected. If you use an unlock code, we recommend using something that's very long, random, and unique. One of the cool things about iOS, which is the sort of thing that iPhones have, is that you can create a alphanumeric password. Something a lot of people don't know about, but is actually super useful, is that instead of having like a 6-digit code, which is not very secure, you can either change it to a really long number if you want, or you can change it like a 14-digit number, or you can change it to an alphanumeric code. So you actually like when you unlock your phone, it'll bring up like a keyboard instead of just like the number pad. And then you enter in a code that is like has letters and numbers and things like that, which is great. Or passphrase. Same thing with Android. So with Android in this case, you do have modern day Androids, you have the ability to have an alphanumeric passcode. And most of them do have encryption on already, but not all of them do. So you'll want to make sure to go into your settings and look for that and make sure that you have encryption turned on. Some of them call it different things, but you'll want to go into your settings app in Android and that little gear icon and make sure that it is in fact turned on. Sometimes it's called device encryption, sometimes it's called encryption, sometimes it's called encrypt phone. But if you look for encrypt, you'll probably find it. And going back to this point that I just really want to reemphasize is that yes, you should have a screen unlock code, and yes, your passcode should be unique, long, and difficult to crack. Do not make it just zeros. All right. So I'm curious to hear from you in the chat because I know what people are going to ask about and I'm happy to talk about, which is basically things like Face ID, Touch ID, biometrics, good or bad. What do y'all think? What do y'all use? What do y'all recommend? I'll throw in my thoughts after yours. All right, cool. So sometimes used for things like bank accounts. Some people don't use biometrics. Oh yeah, and we're talking there is so in this case we're just to clarify, we're talking about Face ID for phones, not for things like TSA checkpoints, which also freaks me out, and I've also paid it. Oh, okay. So really great question actually before while this kind of debate goes on in the chat on, you know, unlock versus passcodes, is that as far as like using, if you were to use an alphanumeric number or alphanumeric password for your phone, basically, how long should it be? I would say as long as reasonably possible. But alphanumeric, like this is unfortunately kind of a guessing game, but if I were to make an educated guess, I think like 12 basically or longer would be great. Um, Again, passphrases could, if you're using that, maybe make it a little bit longer to fit all the words that you would want because you want a random number of words for that, and you need a certain amount of words to make that like less guessable. So yeah, basically, at least that if you're just using like a random string of letters and numbers, like 10 or 12 or 14. Uh, it's interesting because also just like that may change over time. Like that advice might change if like forensics companies like add GPUs or like different sort of like machine learning hardware to their tooling that might, change the game a little bit. And then that's why like as long as possible is kind of the best bet. Cool. Oh, perfect. Okay. But yeah, and when it comes to passphrases, it kind of just to clarify something, when it comes to like passwords that are like random sort of strings and numbers, like 14 is great. When it comes to passphrases, the number of words also potentially matters in some cases, in some like advanced targeted sort of adversary use cases. So you'd want to make sure to use at least like I would say like 4 to 5 words at that point for one of these kind of forensic tools. Again, knowing that the future might be different. The future might include forensics tools with like machine learning capabilities, and then maybe 6 words is actually better. Cool. All right. So as far as biometrics goes, there's a few different opinions and kind of like anecdotes people have shared. And yeah, so basically when it comes to biometrics, there's a lot of it depends. And this is kind of reflected in some people's sort of approaches too, is that there are some cases where it is really important to be able to get to your phone quickly. And if you, so let's say if you are in a place with a lot of cameras pointed at you, you maybe don't want to show those cameras what you're typing necessarily. So biometrics can be useful for that. So of course, the cons around this are unfortunately something that keeps coming up. Um, you may be compelled in this case to unlock your phone, or somebody could just like unlock your phone by taking your phone and pointing it to your face. I personally know people that this has happened to, because there are specific legal protections for passcodes that do not exist for things like Face ID or fingerprint unlock biometrics. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Okay, so in this case, when it comes to yeah, the balance, there's some protection from surveillance with biometrics, so that cameras can't see your passcodes. And passcodes are useful for legal actors. So one of the cool things about, and I'm not as familiar with the way Android phones work, but with iOS, for example, with iPhones, if you turn your phone all the way off before going through like an airport checkpoint, for example, it's full disencrypted and requires that passcode to turn it back on to unlock it. So like even if you have Face ID turned on your iPhone, once you turn it off and you turn it back on, you have to enter in that passcode, which is a nice automatic, perfectly timed feature that exists for just the right occasion, in my opinion. So yeah, in this case, like you might have biometrics turned on in some cases, but then if you're worried about your device being seized, for example, in that iPhone example, you can turn it off and that would basically force biometrics to be turned on. Or you can go into your settings and manually switch off biometrics and go back to a passcode. All right, so if you're worried about the same things for your computer, there's also things you can do there. So there's unfortunately a lot of reason to be concerned here, even as a journalist within the US. This is a story from the Press Freedom Tracker. It's the Press Freedom Tracker is sort of a paper of record, a database of attacks on the press since 2017 that is a joint project between ourselves at Freedom of the Press Foundation and our partner organization, the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ. So in this report, we had a newsroom in Marion, Kansas, which basically had a story in which local law enforcement basically raided the newsroom and then seized computers that were in the newsroom, looking as seizing them as evidence, basically, in order to create those like forensic copies of that data, presumably. And one of the ways that we know that's kind of what they were after is that if you look at the audio transcript from that sort of raid, you hear an officer basically going up to a computer saying, "It's not encrypted, we're good to go." Um, so basically, presumably what was able to happen then is they were able to create a forensic image of every single thing that was happening on that computer, whether that would be emails, notes, contacts, everything else. Um, so very, very important sort of key story that unfortunately is a reminder of some of the dangers that could happen if law enforcement gets access to our devices. And that's why we recommend turning on encryption for our devices, for our laptops and desktop computers. Things like full encryption exists on Macs. So if you're on Mac OS, you can go into your privacy and security settings, make sure that file vault is on. And one of the things, again, a caveat is that you have to have a Mac OS login, so a strong unlock password for your Mac as well. So when you turn on your Mac, it's going to ask for a password when you first turn it on, or if it's suspended and goes, you open your laptop lid back up. That's basically the password we're talking about. That password is what makes that encryption work, and of course, having it be turned off when it's seized. So yeah, so this is kind of useful if you're, especially if you're traveling, you'll want to make sure not just to like close the lid on your laptop, but actually turn it all the way off and make sure that the actual macOS login code you have is long, unique, and random. When it comes to Windows, that's unfortunately a little bit more complicated. Most computers that you get, most PCs that come with Windows, only come with Windows Home, which does not have full disk encryption. But if you were to upgrade to Windows Pro, for example, you can get what's called BitLocker, which is the Windows version of full disk encryption. And it's also available for enterprise and education. But yeah, if you are just like, okay, if this is a computer you just bought yourself, it probably has Windows Home on it, and you may need to upgrade it to Windows Pro before you can actually get this feature. But it works in a similar way with a few additional options. And just to like emphasize with these things, when it comes to voltage encryption, like your computer has to be off for it to do its thing. Because if it's on, it's, decrypted, and that's what Um, that's why you're able to like read text on a screen, for example. All right, so before we move on to malware, there's a question about Veracrypt. So we actually have a lot of great resources on using Veracrypt. Veracrypt is great if you um, are wanting to encrypt like a USB drive, like an external hard drive, or if you just want an encrypted volume that's like a big blob of encrypted space on your computer that you can stash all your kind of more sensitive information on. Especially useful, for example, if you're on Windows Home and you're like, well, I don't have too much sensitive information on this, but I do have these like, set of files that are pretty sensitive. You can use Veracrypt to create an encrypted volume and then just put everything in there, which is great. So yeah, you can kind of go through Veracrypt's documentation there. We also have some guides online at freedom.press, which are pretty good. Cryptomator I haven't really used in a long time, so I would have to look into it again to see if it's still useful in that regard. But good thing to look into. All right, so as far as like device seizure, we talked a little bit about that, but now we're gonna kind of switch gears to malware and the ways to protect ourselves from malware attacks. And we're using malware as kind of this umbrella term for like all the things that the cybersecurity loves creating names for. So viruses and worms and all these other things. Um, this is an example of a malware attack that was reported on by a couple of different people, including the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is sort of, one of our besties, if institutions can be besties, about Dark Caracal, which is basically this sort of like espionage cybercrime group. And in this case, they were able to infect a number of people's phones using a particularly advanced form of malware that they created. And the way it worked was by having people download, sending basically a malicious PDF, for any of you that are familiar with PDFs, a PDF that had malware in it, basically, to using WhatsApp, because in this case, WhatsApp has a tendency to let automatically download things sent to you. And this was something where that included malware in this case and was able to infect their phones. So there's several ways, unfortunately, that malware can get to a phone, including things like what's called sideloading apps, which is like downloading apps, this is especially true on Android, through APK files that maybe haven't been vetted. Um, there's also sometimes third-party app stores that don't necessarily have the same scrutiny for getting apps included into their directories. And even like the Play Store, as much as they try to prevent malware or spyware or other kind of like unwanted sort of software from landing in their app stores, sometimes it does sneak in. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's just like being careful and cautious about downloading new applications. And the other way this happens is through phishing attacks. So you see this sometimes with things like typos, bad grammar. You see like that changing over time because translation has gotten a little bit better. But the reason for that is like phishing attacks sometimes usually happen outside of the country of the jurisdiction of the target. So there may be a bit of a target. Um, sorry, that may be a thing that may change in the future. But for now, that is kind of generally the way things go. There's also things like web addresses that don't have a connection to the service. There are things like attachments, which we talked about with this dark caracal attack. The thing that they all include is some sort of social pressure, something that tries to turn off your logic brain and make you act on impulse. So being like, oh no, I need to act on this now. This is super urgent. Don't think through this, just jump. And so phishing, of course, is a thing to, just be cautious about and making sure to be careful on like what different messages you receive ask you to do things, checking in with, the person it's claiming to be if it might be an impersonation attack.
It's 4 o'clock.
And the other thing to do here is make sure that your operating system is up to date. So the way this works is that these updates on your phone, on your laptop, on your computer, they're really annoying. Your Chrome, your iOS, or whatever, like yelling at you. It's like you should update right now. There's new emojis, check it out. But there's a lot more happening behind the scenes. Is that, for example, when there's a car, for example, that has a defect, that car is recalled. They send it back to the dealership. They fix it, you get it back. When that happens to software, the way those fixes get sent is through the update mechanism. So if there's an issue in Chrome, you get a Chrome update to fix that. If there's an issue in iOS, you get an iOS update to fix it. If there's an issue in Android, you get an Android fix in your Android updates. Same thing with Windows updates. Um, and this is really important because a lot of malware that exists after it's discovered, the vendors, meaning like the people making these operating systems like these Android and iOS, so like Apple and Google in this case, for example, they will look at this malware attack, say like, oh, this took advantage of this security issue with our operating system. Let's go ahead and release a fix for that immediately, or like within a certain reasonable amount of time. And this happens frequently, and that's kind of why it's important to stay sort of like up to speed on these updates. So this is an example from earlier this year, iOS 18.4 and iPadOS 18.4. And so you see this kind of lore behind like what happens when these things happen. It's like, well, we found that, if this kind of attack happens, then sensitive keychain data may be accessible from an iOS backup or from, somebody can hack your phone with the audio cable. Like there's all kinds of like wild attacks that get discovered all the time and get patched or fixed, basically. So this page, for example, like this update advisory, um, just this one had like 50 plus more vulnerabilities. And the same thing goes with these Android updates too. It's not just Apple that's making mistakes. Like all software development has this issue. It's just like there's lots of code, and because of that, there's an increased probability that there's going to be software bugs that sometimes affect security. So yeah, basically, if there's one big takeaway when it comes to protecting yourself from malware, remembering to be on top of your software updates is probably the best way to go. All right, any questions on that so far?
Coming near the end here, folks. So if you do have questions for David, now would be a great time to stick them in the chat about anything that we've talked about so far or otherwise. Any recommendations for burner phones, David?
So burner phones are a it depends on what you mean by that. So I think there's like 20 different definitions of what a phone is. Um, if you want a phone that is completely not tied to your identity from absolutely anyone, it's not impossible, but you do have to really, really, really understand how cell networks work and kind of like have a lot of technical know-how to make that work. It's basically like I would say that that's not maybe always feasible. But if you're looking for a separate phone that you bring with you when you travel, which is I think what many people actually want, is, maybe you have a phone that you have your main important stuff on that you keep, on your person normally. But then if you're traveling, you're worried about going through a border checkpoint, for example, and you're worried that that phone's going to get seized. You might want a phone for that specific situation. And in this case, I would say that yes, unfortunately, like as much as I love to like hem and haw about Apple and how expensive and proprietary their stuff is, the protections against forensics tooling is pretty good in the iOS world. That's not to say that Android isn't catching up. It's just that iOS has historically anyway been a little bit ahead of the curve there. Again, that's only if you have a very, very strong random and unique unlock code. Um, that being said, though, if you're, for example, wanting a travel phone that will have absolutely no sensitive data on it at all ever, then it kind of doesn't matter. If you're going to have all your sensitive data in a phone that you're not even bringing with you, then the phone that you bring elsewhere can kind of just be whatever you want. Like you can load up, all kinds of like garbage apps. And like if the TSA sees those, it's like, well, none of your contacts for notes or emails or messages or anything else right here. So different strategies. Um, yeah, so that it really all depends on the situation. But those are kind of the kind of ways that people have approached it is like if there is going to be a phone that has some sensitive information on it, then yes, like a modern day, like not old, but like a modern day, modern hardware iPhone is probably a good way to go. Um, Again, Android phones are catching up. A year from now, they might be even better at it than iOS. We'll see. But that is something that is very, very useful, especially if you have that Fifth Amendment protection, um, and if that's still being respected. So, yep. All right, so let's see. 1Password versus Google Password. Google's new password manager is intriguing, and it's something that we're looking into, or I'm looking into a little bit. Not that, like, there's, new password managers that pop up like every week at this point. Um, so I haven't looked into Google Password Manager too much. It's getting better. It's better than what it was when it was just kind of like part of like bolted onto Chrome. Um, That being said, the 1Password is very, very, very sort of like feature rich, I would say, and lets you sync across different platforms, lets you use um, log into apps on iOS. So in iOS, for example, you can basically choose your in your settings, you can choose your like passwords app to be 1Password so that if you are on a like app that you want to log in, you install it on iOS, it'll basically just ask you to unlock 1Password and then you can just automatically have your password in answered in that way. Super great convenience feature. I don't think Google's Password Manager lets you do that if you're in the iOS ecosystem, for example. Maybe if you're on Android, it does, but also I believe 1Password lets you autofill on Android as well nowadays. I could be wrong on that. That's one thing to check the 1Password documentation on. I would almost honestly say though, any password manager is better than none. Like 1Password is very much like battle proven. It's been around for years. It's been exceptionally good at sort of like weathering different types of attacks. That being said though, Google's security team is also very good. So I wouldn't necessarily like feel too bad about having a Google password manager. When it comes to web browsers, it really depends. So, um, we'll get into email, but like when it comes to web browsers, there's not that many out there. So Chrome, in terms of just like its actual security, is really good. They have a lot of things that protect against things like malware attacks, for example. Firefox is also catching up to that. They're also pretty good. And then most other browsers are kind of just based on Chrome, so it depends. Chrome is, of course, if you're signing into Google, you have this sort of like connection between what you're doing in Chrome and what you're doing with your Google account that you do have some options of partially opting out of. If you go to like, I think it's like myactivity.google.com, you can kind of see like yeah, just add this link real quick. Oh, that's okay. Yeah, so basically, oops, I misspelled that. So,
I'll correct it for you, David.
okay, cool. Thank you so much. Um, but there are some controls that Google does offer for the amount of sort of snoopiness that Chrome has on your web activity to some degree. That being said, it's still Google. It's still like, their whole deal is trying to get as much sort of, they want to know all about you as you're using the internet using Chrome. So there are ways to turn some of that off, and that's great. I use Firefox a lot. It has like really nice kind of features that I really like. Um, that being said, though, if you're looking for something that has a lot of sort of like ad network privacy sort of stuff, so in Chrome and Firefox, In Chrome, I don't know whether you can still like there's sort of like back and forth on whether ad blocking is still going to be a thing in the future, but in Firefox you can install an ad blocker like, for example, uBlock Origin or Privacy Badger, which will block just the tracking of ads. Um, and that adds a lot more privacy to your online activities against the ad networks that are trying to like understand you a lot better. That being said, though, there are browsers out there that are specifically designed for sort of evading all ad sort of surveillance altogether. Brave is an example of one of them. They are based on Chrome. They have some interesting features. I sometimes use it. So yeah. Um, there's not too many browsers that are like terrible nowadays. Safari and Edge are not as bad as they used to be. They don't necessarily have the same focus on security as other browsers necessarily, but nowadays browsers are all thinking about security. So just making sure that your browser is up to date, I think is probably the more important question on that. I would say use your favorite one, see what you can do privacy wise. Oh yeah, also DuckDuckGo has a browser now. DuckDuckGo has a browser. I've used it on iOS in the past. It's basically fine. Has some nice privacy features built in. So yeah. As far as so that's kind of the issue on browser, the issues with the browsers. There's a sort of like guide that was linked to in chat on that kind of goes in depth on that. When it comes to, I think there was a question about email providers. Email was invented in like the 70s. It was not designed with modern day security concerns at all. So like all of them will have a lot of limitations. Um, and all of them will have kind of the same limitations. Like email is going to be encrypted between you and the email provider in most cases. Um, Google does this, Fastmail does this, like Yahoo does this, like all the modern email providers do this. And that's great. The email provider still has the ability to see all your emails though, and that's going to be true of pretty much every email provider ever. Um, there are some end-to-end encrypted email alternatives. Proton is one of them. Tuta is another one. There's limitations to those. The limitation is that ultimately they only work if you're talking to other email users on their own platforms. So if you're sending a Tuta email to another Tuta user, great. It's end-to-end encrypted as far as we know. If you're sending a Proton email to another Proton email, end-to-end encrypted as far as we know. The second you email literally anybody else, so if you send somebody uh email to Gmail, now Google knows that has a record of that email. So that exists on Google servers for them to surveil and do whatever they want to with it or to be subpoenaed for. So there's an old saying that the E in email stands for evidence. That's kind of the issue is that there's a million ways to shoot yourself in the foot with email. Email also has a lot of metadata. So if you have even an end-to-end encrypted email message, um, that route that the email goes through the systems can still leave a little bit of a trail. You still have like the from address, the to address, sometimes the subject line. Um, that can be particularly sensitive sometimes as well. So yeah, so basically when it comes to email accounts, just say like pick whichever one. Like if we're worried about account security and just making sure your email doesn't get hacked, just any email provider that has good two-factor authentication options is good. And most of them do, like going back to security keys, like Google has support for security keys, Fastmail has support for security keys. Many new email providers also do as well. So yep. And if, for example, you're setting up a newsroom where you're talking to each other with email, but you're going to have work emails anyway, and you're just going to be emailing each other, then something like Proton or Tuta may be basically fine. But then if you're doing something like setting up a tip line on Proton or Tuta, and somebody emails you on Gmail, that's going to be something where, that's not necessarily offering that much protection because now a record of that email exists in your source's email provider as well.
So, David, we are running up on time. I have
Mhm.
dropped a few things in the chat. Folks, there's a link to a survey. And David, if you wouldn't mind putting the QR code up there. Uh,
Yeah.
please do take 2 minutes to fill out this survey for us. It's incredibly useful and we would really, really appreciate it. I've also dropped David's contact info, his email, and his Mastodon account. And I have shared the link to our excellent weekly newsletter, which is bite-sized security tips specifically for journalists. So you'll get that every week in your inbox, and it's really a good time. We work really hard on it, and definitely try to give you the highlights so it's not too heavy of a read. David, anything else to add?
No, I think that's basically it. I would just say that we also have our newsletter. It's actually really good. Our coworker Martin writes it, makes sure that it's very sort of like um, relevant to the needs of journalists. So if you're doing journalistic work and want to stay up to speed with digital security, that's like a great way to do that.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And you can find us at training@freedom.press if you'd like to reach us over email. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.